pre-K-12 school in the nation. So it's very similar to what an advocate would look like at a collegiate level, but these were actually in a high school and we served the entire district. So are we up? We think? Okay, so he went to see. We're good. Don't worry, we're good. We're going to keep going, and hopefully they're going to catch up with us if they're not already on. If you are on, hello, live streaming room. Thank you for being patient. So we're going to talk today about working with a traumatized student. We do have learning standards, which we align to just like a teacher in a classroom, but I'm not going to spend any time talking to you about those. I love this session. This is my favorite session that I do because I think it's so important to be an educator today and know how to work with a traumatized student because we have so many kids who've been traumatized. So what is trauma? Trauma is anything that changes a brain's development, which is a kind of a broad definition. So you might be thinking of sexual abuse, assault, a natural disaster, or even a death. But really anything that changes a brain's development can be considered a trauma. So for me, when I was in first grade, I experienced a trauma, and it's going to sound hilarious to you now, but it actually led to a phobia of vomit, which I know nobody likes it, but for me it's like panic attack inducing, don't take care of my own kids when they're sick, and it's because my dad was sick when I was in first grade and I thought he was dying. And it was like my wires got crossed and associated vomit and death. So it was a traumatic experience for me that's led to a lifelong phobia and a trauma. And even though I know logically that those two are not actually connected, it is impossible for me to have my brain think of it as any other way. So it changed my brain's development, if that makes sense. Oh, yes. Thank you. You're fine. Anybody else need to see you before I give these away? I think we're good. Oh, thank you. I want you guys to meet Ben. Ben was an adorable little baby. Are we good?
Yeah, we need a little more say.
Okay. Ben was an adorable little baby. He was born 9 pounds and 3 ounces, a big baby. He had 10 fingers and 10 toes, and he had a pretty normal APGAR score, if you're familiar with that. As he grew, he hit all of his important developmental milestones. He sat up when he was supposed to. He walked when he was supposed to. He pulled up when he was supposed to. He ate solid food when he was supposed to. He started talking when he was supposed to. All of it in the normal range. But when Ben was about 18 months old, 2 years old, they started noticing some interesting things about him. For example, he would hyper-focus on something individually. In this case, he's hyper-focused on a little Superman toy, and people around him are trying to talk to him and get his attention, but they're unable to get his attention even when they're right next to him. He's hyper-focused on it. When Ben started pre-K, wasn't he a cute little dude? He was excited to be there. He was ready to be there, but the teacher started noticing that Ben kind of had a tough guy complex. So, in other words, Ben started doing things like pushing and hitting and kicking and biting. He would throw toys in the centers. He would be not nice to other kids and really cause a problem. The other interesting thing that they noticed is Ben would start to fall asleep at really unusual times. So maybe they were sitting in circle time and the teacher would look over and Ben was asleep on the kiddo next to him. As Ben continued to grow, he became more and more angry. He started doing things like throwing desks and chairs to the point where they had to clear classrooms. He started having all kinds of behavior issues, and it was a real concern for everybody at the school. The other thing that would happen is Ben would cry at really awkward times when it wouldn't be normal for a little boy to cry. Ben liked to play it cool, but he was the kid who would kind of suck in all the other kids to do naughty things with him. Ben sometimes came to school with marks on his face. Like here, you can see he's got scratches on his face. Sometimes he would have bruises or cuts or bumps of some sort. And when you'd ask Ben what had happened, he would give you an excuse like, well, I fell down the stairs, or my dog scratched me, or I was climbing a tree and slipped and fell. And you really never quite believed what Ben was telling you. He continued to grow, and although he was a good-looking kid, Ben had a ton of problems. Can you think of a Ben in your world? I bet you can. So we're going to look at something called the Adverse Childhood Experience Scale. It's called the ACE scale. How many of you have heard of this, the ACE? A few of you have. It's a very effective tool. You can look it up online very easily. You can just Google it and it'll come up. Basically what it is, it's 10 questions. And the higher your ACE score, the worse it is for you. There's a really strong correlation between a higher ACE score and things like obesity, disease, going to prison, dropping out of high school, and even early death. So we're going to look at Ben's ACE score and kind of walk through that to see what his ACE score is. So this is about while you were growing up, during your first 18 years of life. Did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? Well, Ben was the oldest of 5 children, and they were stair-stepped back to back to back to back. Ben was frequently in charge of taking care of his younger siblings. And when any of his siblings would do something wrong, Ben would pay the price for it because he was the one that was supposed to be watching the other siblings. So this is definitely a 1 for Ben. Did a parent or other adult in the house often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? Well, the answer, unfortunately, is yes. Ben's mom is bipolar, and she lives in poverty. So, because she didn't feel like she had the money to treat her bipolar disorder, she started using recreational drugs, which eventually led to her addiction to meth. So Ben's mom had a hard time. Ben's mom also had a house full of strangers all the time. And Ben was frequently becoming the victim to these strangers. So he's a 2 at this point. Did an adult person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, have you touched their body in a sexual way, or attempt or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? We're not sure about this one for Ben. We don't have any evidence saying that this happened, but we do know that there was kind of a revolving door of people in and out of the house. So while we don't know for sure, we do know that it's a possibility. We're not going to give it a score, but we know that it's possible. Did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, or your family didn't look out for you or for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? Ben definitely felt this way. He never knew when his mom was going to be home. He never knew when his clothes would be clean or dinner would be on the table. And frequently, he knew that his only guaranteed meal of the day would be at school when he got lunch. Did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it? That's a 1 for Ben. So we're now at a 4. Were your parents ever separated or divorced, or maybe not even married? Ben never really knew his dad. He robbed a liquor store when he was 2 years old and went to prison. So he never really knew Dad, and there was a constant, again, revolving door of men in and out of the house. So this is another one. This is another point for Ben. Was your stepmother or mother often, very often, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her, or sometimes often or very often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, hit with something hard, or ever repeatedly hit at least a few minutes, or threatened with a gun or knife? As you can imagine, this is a 1 for Ben. Did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or an alcoholic or who used street drugs? There's another 1. Was the household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? Ben can remember that his mother attempted suicide at least 3 times when he was in elementary school. Did a household member go to prison? And we know the answer for Ben is yes, his dad was in prison. So Ben's ACE score is a 9. That's pretty high. They have said, there's research that indicates that a 3 or above will cause you problems. Really a 1 can cause you a problem, but a 3 or above, you're going to start to have major issues. So we can see that Ben is a 9 of 10 at least, and he has issues. Are any of these things on here Ben's fault? None of them. Not a single one are Ben's fault. So I'm not a scientist or a neuroscientist, but I do want to talk to you about the brain today. This is our brain fully at work. We're using all aspects of our brain when we're learning in a classroom, when we're engaging in everyday activities. However, when we're in survival mode, we are only able to use our brainstem. When we are in that flight or fight response, when we feel fear, we only use our brainstem. It's our only capacity. And it's not until you feel safe that you can begin to learn. So do you think Ben is learning anything?
No.
No, he's not. Ben is literally using his brainstem for 100% of his brain's activity because Ben never feels safe. You know, children have a circle of security. They have needs. We have to respond. And guys, we have to respond with oversight, delight, help, and enjoyment. Then they welcome you into your world and you become a safe haven for them and they feel safe and secure. Well, let me give you an example of responding with delight, oversight, help, and enjoyment. We typically don't. I can think of a young man at our school who was a lot like Ben. He was in trouble all the time. And every day of his life, he wore a hat to school. Now, hats were not allowed at our school. It was against the dress code. And so before he would even get into a class, every single day he was getting in trouble for wearing this hat to school. So one day our principal kind of snuck around and followed him and found that he had 10 negative interactions with adults before the day even started, before 8:30 a.m. Those interactions were like, why are you wearing your hat today? You know that that's against the rules. I'm going to take that hat. I'm going to give you detention. What is wrong with you? Those are the kinds of interactions people are having with him. They're tired of him wearing his hat to school and other things. So how would that have changed for this young man if instead of responding that way, if I would have responded with oversight, still had him follow the rules, delight, help, and enjoyment? What if I walked up to him and said, hey, I am so happy to see you today. I am so glad that you chose to come to school. Thank you for coming. You know, I see that you're wearing your hat, and I'm really nervous that somebody might try to take it away. Would you let me keep it in my office for you until the end of the day so you don't get in trouble? I responded with oversight, made him follow the rule. Delight, happy to see him, glad he was at school. Help, I offered to keep his hat for him, and I could honestly tell you I enjoyed the conversation. How different do you think that interaction would be with him in the future? You know, this same boy, the first time I was my first year as a counselor when I had him, and he was pretty naughty. And I know that I have the one major button I have that kids push is if they're disrespectful to me in front of their peers, it gets me every time. And he did that in the cafeteria one day, and I kind of got up into him and got in his face. I'm like, don't you talk to me that way. And I feel somebody pulling my shirt and pulling me back. And I turn around and look kind of in shock, and it was my principal. And he got me aside, and later he said, Michelle, did you know his fist was balled up and he was about to hit you? I said, no, because you can't respond that way to a kid like that. You just can't respond that way. So what I learned was, first, I needed a break when my button got pushed. I needed to walk away. And two, what I learned with this child who did it again a couple other times was if I would wait till I was not mad anymore and then call him into my office and say, you know, that just really hurt my feelings. He would every time say, oh, Mrs. Sutherland, I am so sorry. I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. I would say, I'm always nice to you. I'm respectful of you. I'm kind, and you act that way. It worked every time with him, and he corrected his behavior. So this circle of security is really important, and the way we respond makes a huge difference. So in this circle, we have the attachment cycle. We have needs expressed and needs met. Over here on the comfort side, we have inhibitory neurotransmitters and parasympathetic nervous system, which equals comfort. And over here on the other side of distrust, we have the excitatory nervous system and the sympathetic excitatory neurotransmitters in the sympathetic nervous system equaling distrust. So what does all that mean? Again, I'm not a scientist, but I am going to share with you what that means. The sympathetic nervous system's primary response is to stimulate the body's flight or fight response. The parasympathetic nervous system, however, its primary process is to rest and digest. So which do you want in your classroom? Flight and fight or rest and digest?
Second.
Yeah, rest and digest. That's definitely what you want. The inhibitory neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that transmit message to your nerves to inhibit you, while the excitatory neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that transmit messages to excite you. And while we always want kids to be excited about the subject matter, do we want an excitable kid in our classroom or one that's inhibited and making good decisions? Making good decisions. We want the inhibition. We want to be over here with comfort, right? We want to stay away from distrust and be over here with comfort. When you have a lack of felt safety, it manifests itself in emotional deregulation, which we see all the time with our kids who are hard. We program the neurosystems of children by helping them regulate, so we have to teach them and help them. The parasympathetic nervous system has to get exercised, just like anything you use. If you don't practice it and exercise it, it's not going to work correctly. And guess what it all starts with? A relationship. I'm a huge advocate of having a relationship with kids. It all starts with a relationship and a connection. So, did you know that when a baby is born, he or she has the same neurochemical profile as his or her mother? What kind of profile did Ben have the day he was born? What was it? He was bipolar. What else?
Addiction.
He was addicted to meth. Anything else? Did mom live in the flight or fight response? She probably did. So was any of those things Ben's fault when he was born?
No.
Not a thing. So when we're working with kids who are hard, who have suffered trauma, we have to stop addressing the kid and start addressing the behavior of the kid. It's not the kid's fault, especially our little ones. It's all the things that have happened to them, all the trauma they experience, and the way their brain is operating. So what affects neurochemistry? There are three things: nutrition, mental illness, and trauma. Which one do we have a shot at affecting? Nutrition. We have a shot at affecting nutrition. There's also three pillars of trauma-informed care. There's felt safety, there's connection, and there's self-regulation. Which one do we have a chance at affecting? Connection. It's the one that's up to us, isn't it? We can't expect the kid to create the connection. We have to create the connection with the kid. Does that make sense? So I have an amazing video that I'm going to show you. It's called the Still Face Experiment. I'm going to sneak behind you. And this video is going to give you a kind of an insight to what it's like when you deal with trauma.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. she points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing?
I wanted you to see there was a happy ending. So what does that tell you about trauma and how it might affect your kids in your classroom? What does this say to you?
Any little thing could have trauma on any person.
Any little thing could cause trauma and create a reaction, yeah.
What you reflect helps what they reflect.
Oh, that's good. What you reflect helps with what they reflect. That's good.
Anytime you can positively interact with the student, you should do it.
Reacting positively with the student every single time you can is super, super important. Is that what you were going to say?
Yes.
Right. Have you ever, can I borrow this for a second? Have you ever seen a parent do this while their kids are talking to them? I do it. We all do it. But this still face experiment kind of horrified me because I thought of all the times my kids have said, "Mom, Mom," and they've been talking to me and I have no idea what they've said because I had a phone in my hand, right? So even little micro traumas like that can have an impact on our kids. So we're going to talk about trauma and trust. There's connection principles, empowering principles, and correction principles. Did you know that 90% of behavior is learned through a nonverbal interaction? 90% is learned nonverbally. So I want you to look around this classroom. There's all kinds of nonverbal messages happening in this classroom. What are some that you can see? What are some nonverbal messages?
People that are deep in thought.
Deep thinkers?
Yes.
What? I'm sorry?
Yawning, maybe.
Yawning. People are maybe tired of me talking, maybe.
I don't see anybody doing that. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Nodding, eye contact.
Eye contact and nodding. What about what's on the walls?
The yellow paint sticks out to me because it's kind of a joyful, welcoming.
A bright color.
Well, that's going to draw the attention to the front of the classroom.
Yep. I know you can't see it, but I'm noticing on the back wall there's a senior picture collage, it looks like, from each year. And what that tells me is this teacher has a connection with her students for them to want to give her their senior picture, right? That's one thing that I'm noticing. Anything else that you can see?
Her achievements,
His or her achievements on the wall. There's a lot of information in here that's presented non-verbally. There's a soccer schedule, there's a calendar, there's a bell schedule, there's some rules posted on the wall. There's a lot of non-verbal learning happening in this classroom. There's geometric shapes on the ceiling. Lots of non-verbal things are happening here. So what I want you to consider is, instead of throwing words at people, help them learn non-verbally. So 3 ways you can do that is get on their level, hold hands or touch, and a voice modulation. So I did this with my kids. And I have a son who's 12, about to be 13. And I don't know if you know this, but when frontal lobes start to develop, kids go crazy. They absolutely lose their baby minds. And it's because their mind is a baby. It's their frontal lobe is a baby, and so they revert to this childlike behavior a lot of the time. Every kid does it, but for some reason, boys seem to be worse when this happens. And so my lovely, wonderful, intelligent, bright, funny, gifted son started throwing 2-year-old temper tantrums, and I thought I had failed as a parent. I had not failed as a parent, but his frontal lobe was starting to develop. And so in the middle of one of these temper tantrums, I had just been to this 8-hour training in which I developed this 1-hour training for. And so I decided to try this. So I got down on one knee, because he was on the floor, and I took his chin very softly. I did not hurt my child. And I put my thumb underneath his chin and my finger up on his chin, and I held his little face where he could see me, and I lowered my voice. Now, for some people, this is an easy thing, but I'm a yeller. I like to yell. I escalate with my kids, and it's a real act of will to make myself not do that. And this amazing thing happened. Well, actually, the first thing that happened is he said, "Stop trying that counselor voodoo on me." But the next thing that happened was he calmed down. He de-escalated, and we were able to have a conversation. And I tapped into another part of his brain, thank goodness. So it's really amazing to watch that when you start using these other techniques, things start to change and it starts to work. Another great example of voice modulation is both of my kids had this amazing pre-K teacher. Her name's Elizabeth Dalma. And the first time I met her and walked into her classroom with my older son, I thought she was crazy because she never spoke above a whisper. She kind of sounded like Snow White. And I thought, she's going to get eaten alive by these 4-year-olds. Have you met a 4-year-old? Do you know what they're like? Yes. Have you met my 4-year-old? But as I got to know her better and started to observe her in her class, this magical thing would happen. And the softer her voice got, the softer the kids' voices got. It was crazy. It was like a magic trick. I couldn't believe what I was watching. But the quieter she became, the quieter they became. And she had the most perfect classroom management of any teacher I've ever met. And I thought she was going to get eaten alive. So it's really interesting when your nonverbal cues start to help with the learning of the classroom. In connection principles, you want to eliminate any fears that they have. Rational or irrational, whichever it is, you want to eliminate their fears. You want to pay attention to their communication. If they're angry and stomping around and have their arms crossed, is that a good time to talk to them about something important?
No.
Probably not. You're probably not going to get the reaction that you want from them, are you? You need to respond flexibly. So you might have a way that you always do things. Maybe it's a hat rule. But maybe you have this one kid that you just let him wear a hat sometimes, or you let him earn the reward of wearing a hat on Fridays. Whatever it looks like for you, be flexible in your response instead of rigid. Be empathetic, and we're going to talk more about that in a second. And strive for emotional balance yourself. Like I told you earlier, I had the button that if kids were disrespectful of me in front of my peers, it pushed my button, and I kind of lost my mind. I had to learn that about myself and learn that that's when I needed a break. I needed to walk away. I taught this class to one group, and a teacher said, you know, I teach 5 hours a day. I have classes back to back to back all day, and there's no real time for me to take a break. So what I have to do is if I've had a hard class, I have this one class that's hard every time, and they come in and they leave, and it's been a hard hour. When my next class comes in, 2 things could happen. I could either be like, get out your pencils and your paper and do your assignment quietly, and they react and get really angry with this class of kids, and they didn't do anything. But he said, what I do instead is I said, hey guys, I just want you to know I need 5 minutes. I need 5 minutes of quiet. I need your help with this. If you would do this bell work assignment for 5 minutes quietly, we're going to have a much better hour. And he said, you know, the crazy thing is it works. And I don't know if you've ever done this, but have you ever asked your kids for help? It's amazing. When you ask them to give you help with something, they're like, oh, majority, I want to help a teacher. That would be so cool if I were able to be a helper in this situation. So ask them for help. You are not perfect. You are not the all-powerful Oz. You are not in the perfect control. Sometimes you need help, and these little guys are the perfect people to give it to you. Use your intuition and insight. We have hundreds of years of education and working with kid experience in this room and in your schools and individually. You have an instinct and intuition, and if you're not using it, it's going to not serve you well. Use your intuition and insight. Trust your gut. Trust your instinct. If something is wrong, something is probably wrong. And the worst thing you can do is be overcautious, or the best thing you can do is be overcautious. The worst thing you can do is ignore it and something really bad is going on. So use your intuition and insight. And then help them regulate their body and their emotions. If they're hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, let them have a bottle of water on their desk. If they're hot or if they're cold, help them regulate their body temperature. Help them regulate their body and their emotions. I want to talk to you about empathy, and I just did a whole session right before this on empathy, so I could talk about it all day. But being empathetic means putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and imagining how they would feel. Now, I could spend the next 3 hours talking to you about what it means to be empathetic, or I could show you a really short, less than 3-minute video by my spirit animal, Brene Brown, and she will explain to you empathy much quicker. So let me do that.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
I absolutely love this video to the point where I play it in every session that I am in. And I think it makes a huge difference when we can act this way. So how would it change the dynamics of the relationships you have with kids when they told you something, instead of immediately trying to fix it, which we tend to do as educators, we want to fix things, for you to say, man, I am so glad that you told me. Thank you for trusting me with that information. Now, you might have to do something about it, but what if your first step was just to listen? I did this to my kids. Again, they were like, what's up with the counselor voodoo? But they really began to appreciate it. So with your connection principles, you want to be authoritative, but don't yell, which is not easy for me because I'm a yeller. Make eye contact, match their behavior, playful interaction, and healthy touch, only with permission. You never want to touch a kid who doesn't like to be touched, and you need to ask before you do. But a healthy touch could be like a high five, can have a high five. How about a fist bump? How about a pat on the shoulder or a pat on the back? Something light and soft and not a big deal, right? The matching behavior one, I love to tell the story about a 6'5", 300-pound 7th grade boy who was autistic and had meltdowns. And it kind of got scary because he was a big guy. So he also happened to love computers. So what we would do when he would start to have a meltdown is together we would lay flat on the floor and reboot ourselves like we would reboot a computer. And this kid, this big giant kid, and I would lay on the floor and we'd press the on button and we'd sit up and slowly kind of come alive. And my goodness, it worked for him every time. But I did it with him. I didn't expect him to do it by himself. He may still be doing that to this day. I don't know. Because it did work for him every single time. So I matched his behavior. If somebody, have you ever done this with a little one, is kind of acting out of control or stomping their feet, do it back to them. Oh, you're just so mad, aren't you? Have you ever tried doing that? It really like snaps them out of whatever they're in and matches their behavior.
Wait, what do you mean by playful interact? Like, did you just mean like joking back and forth?
Yeah, so that would be good. One that I like was they're trying to boss you around and you say to them, are you asking or telling? Something like that where it's just kind of lighter, where you're still getting your point across. Are you asking me or telling me? But you're laughing with them and smiling when you say it, and it's more playful. Does that make sense? Yeah. Can anybody else think of another example of that? Okay. So did you know that 90% of the time when a breakdown happens, it happens during a transition? How many transitions do we have a day? So many. Who's elementary in here? Would one of you tell me what a typical elementary day looks like? If there is a typical. What do you do in a day? What's an example?
Well, you have rotations.
Rotations?
Yes, you have rotations every 15 minutes or whatever.
So every 15 minutes you're rotating to a new activity. That's all you had to say. So there's a transition every 15 minutes is what you're telling me all day long.
Usually
Or more.
morning,
Okay?
and then in the afternoon there's different transactions. For the
So you're transitioning all the time. What about, who's a middle school or high school teacher? Anybody in here? What do you teach?
English, 7th through 12th.
7th through 12th grade English. Okay, so what does a typical day in your classroom look like?
They come in, they sit down, do the bell ringer, do the lesson, and then get up and leave.
Okay, so they come in, they sit down, they do the bell work or the bell ringer, and then they do the lesson. Now, in a lesson, are you just sitting there the whole time? No, so what kinds of things happen during a lesson?
It just depends on the lesson. We might read, I might teach something at the board.
Okay.
I might do something on the smart board.
So you might read, you might teach something on the board, might use a smart board, maybe a small group activity, maybe an individual activity. So in a single hour of a day, kids have multiple transitions. We transition all the time, and we have to. Research tells us that kids have to have transitions all the time based on their developmental age, right? So we have to do that. But it would be really helpful if we could create the visual markers of a transition to help a kiddo. So for example, if a bell schedule is posted in your classroom, that's a visual marker. If you have a kiddo who has especially a hard time, what if you wrote down what you're going to do for the day, and instead of even having to say anything, you just stuck it on their desk when you walk by so they would know what you're going to do? How might that help? It might really be good. Or what if you just wrote it on the whiteboard for your whole class to know what you were going to do in the day? It was going to help them through the transitions, all of them. You know, when we talk about empowerment principles, and we have sensory diets like weighted blankets. Anybody here use a weighted blanket in a classroom? They're so good. Oh my goodness. They can make people feel calm and safe, even like a heavy textbook in a lap. A lot of autistic children will wear a weighted vest, something like that. It can be really, really helpful. We talked about transitions, touch points. You are the touch point for a lot of your kids. They need to see you maybe more than once a day, maybe in the morning during your class period, and then at the end of the day, they see you. Artifacts. My son gave his primary elementary counselor a sock monkey one year for Christmas, about 5 years ago. And she sent me a note this Christmas and said, I just want you to know that your sock monkey has a job. It goes to school, it goes to class with one of my students every day. They come in, they get the sock monkey, and they go to class, they bring it back at the end of the day. And she said that is the only way the student will go to class, is if that sock monkey is there with it. So that's a great example of an artifact. It could be something small. There's some great little quiet fidgets that you can use. Not the fidget spinner, I didn't say that. Ritual, same thing every day, managing hydration and blood sugar, regular physical activity. If you need to do a spelling test while you're walking a lap around the track and do it verbally, do that. Meeting their nutritional needs, and again, healthy touch. Using life value terms like, let's try that, gentle and kind. Let's be gentle and kind when we do that. Why don't we use your words? I still say that to adults. Why don't you use your words? Quit being so angry. And then with respect. So if you have somebody disrespectful of you, instead of going, quit being so disrespectful of me, what if you said, I'd like for you to try that again, except this time can you do it with respect? And you just ask them to try it again. Some proactive strategies, offer choices as often as you can. Let's say you're going to have a new seating chart, and the day before you say, okay, Sally, would you like to sit here or here? Two things that you can live with. Love and logic, people. If you don't know it, learn it. It's so good. Making compromises and even behavioral redos. Sixth graders love to run through the lunch line. So instead of just giving detention when they would, I would send them back to their seat and tell them to walk back through the lunch line and redo their behavior. The ideal response should be immediate, if you can, direct, efficient, action-based, and leveled at the behavior, not the child. Because let's remember, when we're talking about Ben earlier, were any of the things that caused Ben's trauma his fault? No, we have to address the behavior, not the child. Well, speaking of Ben, I want to tell you the truth about Ben. His name is not Ben, it's Will. This is my son. He is totally fine. He does not have any of those behavior problems. He just happens to be a really emotive kid. And so I used his pictures with his permission to tell a story about kids that I've counseled before. I'm not on meth. I do not have a problem. I just used his pictures to help tell a story about many of the kids that I've worked with, because we all kind of have a Ben in our lives, don't we? Yeah. Do you all have any questions? Yes. Leveled at the behavior, not the child.
Can you flip back to that?
Yep. I can. All of our PowerPoint presentations will be online after Engage is over, so you will have access to these in a couple of weeks. They will, and I will come out and do these trainings for your school as well. And it doesn't cost you anything. Any other questions? Thank you guys so much for coming today. I really appreciate your time.